So in this video, we're finally ready to put together our different transformations of sine and cosine to create full sinusoidal graphs. All right, so far we've learned these separately, but now we're actually gonna put them all together. So we learned what happens if we put a number in front of our trig function that affects the amplitude, the height of the waves. B, this number in here changes how often my graph repeats and has that nice little formula, 2 pi over b, to figure out how often my graph is going to repeat. And D, this number at the end here, changes the midline where the middle of my graph goes through. All right. The reason it's A, B, and D, not A, B, and C, is technically a lot of times you'll see a C in here. All right, this moves your graph left and right, but to me it just makes the graphs a little bit harder to deal with. Not really worth learning right now. So we're just going to focus on amplitude, period, midline. All right, C is called phase shift, if you see that anywhere, if you're trying to Google sinusoidal graphs. All right, we're not learning phase shift. All right, so here's my general strategy. The first thing, I need to label my x and y axis. So I'm going to label my x-axis based on the period. So remember, we're using that 2 pi over b to label my x-axis. All right, so I'm going to do that first. Then next, I'm going to put the midline on my graph. Midline is just that D value at the end. All right, generally you can put that on your graph as a dotted line. When I'm doing it on the slides, it'll be like a solid line just because it's quicker for me to draw. We're going to use the amplitude and the general shape of sine or cosine to add points. And then we make a wave. All right, so let's go through the whole process with 3 sine of 4x minus 2. So the first thing I want to do is label this x-axis. All right, normally these are our 4 quadrants. But once we start changing this value, these are not the 4 quadrants anymore. They're related. But the thing I know is that the period of this graph, how often this graph repeats, is 2 pi over b, which simplifies to pi over 2. So right away, I know I'm going to put pi over 2 at this far right tick mark. And we learned 2 different ways to figure out the values in the middle. The way I like to do it is if I cut this in half, so pi over 2 times a half is pi over 4. All right, so halfway back to the 0 is pi over 4. Then I can cut halfway again to get pi over 8. All right, so that's that tick mark. That's an 8, not a 0. And I'm missing this one here, but now that I know that each tick mark is a distance of pi over 8, if I do it 1, 2, 3 times, I'm going to get that missing tick mark. All right, so that's pretty much exactly what we did when we learned the period, nothing different there. All right. Next thing I want to do is want to put the midline of my graph, and the midline is just this value at -2, so I have to go down, -1, -2. I'm going to put my midline on my graph. Again, I'm going to put it as a solid line just because it's easy for me on the slide, but you should put it as a dotted line. And then next, I'm going to look at the amplitude. So the amplitude is 3, so I know my graph can go up 3, 1, 2, 3, so it can go up to 1, and then go down 3, -3, -4, -5. So these are going to be the extreme values of my graph. And now I think about the shape of sine. So sine starts in the middle, goes up, middle, down, middle. All right, so that's my normal sine shape. So I'm going to start on the midline. At my next tick mark, remember to use these tick marks to help you. The next tick mark lines up with the highest value. The next tick mark lines up with I'm back on the midline. The next tick mark lines up with the lowest value. Final tick mark with the last value. All right, then I just connect it with a wave. So that's the whole process. X-axis, midline, y-axis, wave. All right, let's go through it again. This one, period, 2 pi over 1/8. That's the same as 2 pi times 8 over 1, which is 16 pi. So this far right tick mark is representing the kind of ending of my single wave, 16 pi. Cut that in half, cut that in half, triple it. Average out these two. There's a bunch of different ways you could do it, but that's just the way I've always done it. Midline is at 1 and should be dotted, but that's quicker. Amplitude is 2, so I can go up 2 and go down 2, 0, -1. These are my extreme values. I think about my shape of cosine. Cosine starts above the midline, then it's in the middle, then it's low, then it's middle, then it's high. So that's my normal cosine shape. So normally cosine would start up here, but this negative, remember it flips it. So now I'm kind of looking at that shape. I'm going to start at the lowest value. Then I'm on the midline. Again, I'm using my tick marks to line this up. My next tick mark, I'm at the highest value. Next tick mark back on the midline. Next tick mark at the lowest value. All right, and that's my final graph. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. Try to graph 4 sine of 2x plus 3. Again, it's generally 1, 2, 3, 4 is the way I would go about putting it all together. All right, so pause the video, try that one. I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. All right, my final answer looks like this. So period, 2 pi over 2 is pi, half, half, triple. Midline up to 3. My amplitude is 4, so I can go up 4 from that midline. I can go down 4 from that midline. And my sine shape, midline, high, midline, low, midline. All right, so I follow that same sine shape. All right, so this is my graph. If it was the exact same question, but it was for cosine of 2x, I would do everything the same. The only difference is I would start high, midline, low, midline, high. So this would be the graph if it was cosine instead of sine. Again, one really important thing is make sure you're using these tick marks to line up your extreme values, because that'll keep it stretched out correctly. All right, so important things are just make sure you know the 3 basic movements. All right, you can move the midline, the amplitude, and the period. And then again, really make sure you're using those tick marks. They're there for a reason to represent these kind of important points, the 5 important points on your graph. So make sure you're lining them up to create your final graph.